Hi, my name is Travis English. I work for Kaiser Permanente as the Chief Design Engineer. I used to draw plans for a living, and now I'm more like a film critic. I look at other people's plans and I say, so it's a fun job. And I'm joking. Really, a lot of my job is to encourage and empower our designers to do great work for us. But that's also a fun job. So the next era of building HVAC design will require we generalize the behavior of energy validation. The next era of building HVAC design will require we generalize the behavior of energy validation. That's a public speaking trick, by the way. If you want something to sound important, you repeat it slowly and emphasize words. These words, generalize the behavior. What does that mean? Generalized behavior is something that I do most of the time. That's what it means to be generalized. So I have an autistic son. If you have special needs kids, you go through these black belt parenting classes called ABA, and the goal is to generalize behaviors. So, for example, my son, when he was 4, didn't make eye contact. We started telling him, Logan, look me in the eye when you talk to me. And at first he hated that. And then he started doing it. We kept reminding him. He did it more and more. And eventually we dropped the reminders, and now he just does it. So generally, as a generalized behavior, when Logan talks to you, he'll make eye contact. Tonight I'm talking about energy validation. And I was a design engineer. I did energy models. We have Title 24, so energy modeling is pretty common in California. And so it's fair to say, I did 10 energy models a year. That's probably low. 20 energy models a year for 12 or 13 years of a design career. I probably did 150, 200 energy models in my design career. And I can count on one hand the number of times that I saw the bills, less than 5 times. So I validated my energy designs 5% of the time, 2% of the time. I remember one in particular was the South Coast Repertory Theater. I did the design and I stayed in touch with the building engineer, and one day he sent me, a year and a half worth of bills, and I compared it to my model, and I was like, oh my God, that wasn't even close. So when I came to the owner's side, my team and I were charged with using design to make a difference in our energy use. And at the time, as the owner, we didn't ask for energy models. The designers often did them, but we didn't look at them. So we started asking to see them. We started collecting them. By 2012, we set a policy in place. We established energy targets. We set rules for life cycle costing and that type of thing. And so by about 2015, 2016, we had a set of 14 buildings where we had an energy model, and we opened the building, and so we had data to look at. And we found that actual energy use was quite a bit higher. This slide says that the actual was between minus 19% and plus 160% of the model. Don't let that fool you. Only one building was below the model. The rest were high. And we actually have this forum once a year. We bring all the architects and contractors that do work for us into a fancy room at a hotel, and we talk about topics. And one of our executives, a COO of National Facility Services, and our Chief Energy Officer, put those pictures up on the screen in front of the room and said, what's going on here? You guys tell us the energy is going to be one thing and it's always higher. What gives? And the designers were horribly offended by that. They cried out. They said, that's not fair. Those energy models are for LEED, or they're for Title 24, or they're for life cycle costs. They're for comparative purposes. They're not actually supposed to predict the energy. And that became quite a discussion for quite a few months. Designers and energy modelers would say, you can't use our models to predict performance because we don't know the real operating hours. We don't know the occupancy. We can't predict the weather. We don't know how people are going to use the building. And on the other side was the finance perspective. Every month, project teams come to us and they ask for money based on the energy models. And if the guys building the models are telling us we can't trust them, what do we stop giving them money? I tried to play Switzerland a little bit. I feel like, look, of course, the design community can't really stand behind the energy models. In my career, I only saw the bills 2% of the time, 5% of the time. So how could I possibly have any confidence that those models are going to be right? I wouldn't want to take liability for that. So how are you supposed to do it anyway? How do you actually validate design? Well, if you read your USGBC or IPVMP, They say to wait a year, collect the energy data, the weather data, the occupancy data, take your design energy model and update it with actual data and look at the variances. This is a calibrated energy model analysis. Hopefully you guys have heard of this. Well, I think this is stupid. First, when you get to a year, your general contractor, your controls guy, your HVAC guys, all their warranties are done. You may have some extended warranties on equipment, but that's not going to do you a lot of good. Second, this is no small task. This one cost us about 30 grand in design fees, and it took the guy the better part of 2 months to do it all. And we didn't find a lot of actionable stuff. I want you to look at the top 2 variances. First off, there's that 10% variance at the HVAC units. The energy modeler had to derate the EER of the HVAC equipment in order to calibrate the model. Yeah, it makes sense. If you buy a car and the sticker says it's going to get 50 miles to the gallon, you kind of know that in real life it's going to get 35, right? So when the sticker on the HVAC unit says that the EER is 17, you got to treat that with a little bit of realism. The biggest variance in this building is unaccounted for natural gas. And I think after we published this report, we have accounted for it. Every time you start and stop a boiler, you lose about a quarter of the nameplate in BTU as a cycling loss. And so in this building, the heating load is like 1,000 MBTU, and we use 3,000 MBTU, which is to say we spend twice as much natural gas cycling the boilers as we do heating the building. We can fix that. Sure, it's easy. We add a tank. But this report didn't come out until 15 months after the building opened. We could add a tank, but that's a capital project. We need to initiate a project, write a business case, get in line, and ask for money. So I think waiting a year is dumb. Let's look at energy earlier than that. I want to tell you this story. This is a LEED Platinum building in San Francisco. So when we opened it, it had a LEED Platinum plaque on it. And by the way, I had a 400-page final commissioning report in my hand saying that the building was working perfectly. But when we looked at the first 3 months worth of energy data, it said, oh my God, it's double and a half what it was supposed to be. But it was under warranty. We called up the design engineer, the commissioning agent, the controls guy, the contractor, and to this team's credit, everybody came running to the problem and spent about 3 months troubleshooting and taking corrective action. And it worked. It knocked the average monthly down about 50%, still higher than design, but it did get a whole lot better. So by this time it's about 2016, and we rewrote our design contracts and our internal standards with some really key changes. Today we don't want the output of an energy model. We want an energy prediction. So the energy model for compliance is between you and the Energy Commission. The energy model for LEED is between you and the USGBC. For the owner, for our M&V, we want a prediction of the energy performance that we're going to see in the building. The second thing we said is that the margin of error on energy models is not 0. You need to assume it to be at least 10% in the non-beneficial direction. And 10%, frankly, is pretty giving. The best calibrated energy models we see are about 10% accurate. For new designs, 15 to 20% is probably more realistic. But we said assume at least 10%. And the 10% is because of these things, right? We saw this list before. I got to tell you this story. It was a couple weeks after we made the 10% decision. Me and one of my engineers got invited to a meeting. The project manager and the architect came in. The estimators were there. The design engineer was in. He brought in his energy modeler. And the energy modeler was carrying a 900-page binder. For every subsystem of the building, he'd come up with 3 alternatives, sometimes more. And for every alternative, he did sketches and narratives and sent those to the estimator. And the estimator did first costs, and he did energy models for everything, 20 energy model scenarios. And me and my engineer had a calculator. So we looked at the first subsystem, we added up, the models and figured out what about 10% of the average was, and we said, look, all these options are within 10% of each other. Let's go ahead and go with the lowest first cost option. And then we looked at the next subsystem and we said, wow, look, all these options are within 10% of each other. Let's go ahead and go with the lowest first cost option. And system after system after system, we had that same conversation. The discussion was actually over in like 15 minutes. And this energy modeling guy, you could see it in his face. He was crushed. This guy had spent a month of his life working on all these options, hundreds of hours. I don't think I've ever felt worse for a consultant. It was pretty bad. So now we tell our energy guys all the time, if you're looking at two models and option two isn't beating the error in the model, stop there. Don't go through a big exercise of sketches and narratives and pricing. Just stop. If you're an energy guy and you often work in units of EUI, kBTU a square foot a year, and we get guys all the time come in and show us the energy model. They say the EUI for this option is 43.2. We say, no, man, drop the decimal point and round it up to the nearest 5. Do yourself that favor. Okay, so we talked about the 4-month M&V. What if we did it sooner? How about we do something like 2-month M&V? Let me explain this one because it's a little bit different. See, every time we get our energy bills, we also get HDD and CDD data. Remember cooling degree days and heating degree days? Well, electricity doesn't really correlate well to either cooling degree days or heating degree days, but natural gas is a fun variable to look at. When you look at your energy model, you use design weather data, and that gives you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 points to look at the gas consumption versus the heating degree days on the x-axis, and you can draw a line, come up with a line to predict gas consumption using the variable of heating degree days. And that line will match the data pretty well. Your R-squared value is in the 90% here, right? Well, then when your monthly data comes out, you can compare it to that model. And if it's within about 10% of the model, great. If it's more, then something isn't working to the design intent, then it's time to go fix it. In this case, so far, the building is running at or below the model. We'll see if that continues as we get into the heating season. But hold on. During that last slide, I said something crazy that should have put your antenna up, and I want to come back to it. I said, and I quote, electricity doesn't really correlate well to either cooling degree days or heating degree days. I don't know if anybody caught that. But because wait a minute, if 40% of our electrical use is HVAC systems, those are supposed to use more energy when the weather gets hotter. Those are supposed to use less energy when the weather gets cooler. So what do you mean they don't? Every time we talk to energy modelers, they always tell us about the need to correct for weather, right? Slight changes in weather are supposed to cause big energy changes. Look, the truth is they don't. This is a set of 20 buildings, all of which opened, 2007, 2008, and beyond. And so these all comply to Title 24. So these systems should be very responsive to the weather. But you can look at all these buildings and you can look at 3 years worth of data and you can try to correlate cooling degree days and heating degree days to the electrical consumption. And in most cases, that correlation is poor. For a good statistical model, you're looking for an R-squared value of 90% or better. I've highlighted anything that's better than 70% here. But even then, you can see that 3/4 of the time, the correlation between cooling degree days and electrical consumption just literally is very bad. Oh, and by the way, I lied. Actually, I didn't lie, but I did imply that natural gas correlates well to heating degree days. Well, guess what? It doesn't. Again, 75%, 80% of the buildings that we have, the month-to-month variance in natural gas is statistically very poorly related to the weather. Now, as an HVAC engineer who's been in the business for 20 years, this is insane to me. It's like, you know what, I should just go home. What am I doing with my life? In these buildings, you only use natural gas for 2 things, water heating and building heating. Water heating is supposed to be a lot less. So how the hell could it even be possible that natural gas consumption is literally uncorrelated to the weather data? And by the way, these are medical office buildings. These are B occupancy spaces. In hospitals, this is actually much, much worse. We do so much constant volume reheat in hospitals that climate almost doesn't matter. So back to measurement and verification. We talked about 2-month measurement and verification, but I think we can actually do better than that. What I'm actually talking about with our design consultants now is what we call 0-month M&V. I don't want to wait until 2 months to go see if the systems are working to the design intent. I want to know on day 1 that the energy systems are meeting design intent. And I believe that's what commissioning is supposed to do. I don't know if I mentioned this yet, but on all 14 buildings that I talked about in the early slides, we did full-blown commissioning on all of those projects. So hopefully everyone knows what this is, right? This is a trend log for from a building automation system. You have time on the x-axis, and this one happens to be for economizers. So the blue line is outside air temperature, and the yellow line is return air temperature, and the gray is the damper position. So if the blue line is below the yellow line, then the damper should be open. And if the blue line is above the yellow line, then, right, hold on, some of this stuff isn't right. So I was in my office one day and I was looking at this chart, and one of my engineers comes in and we're looking at this chart together. He says something that changed my life. I'm not kidding, it changed my life. He says, gosh, it'd be a whole lot easier to look at this if we put outside air on the x-axis. So what? Something like this. This is a different project, by the way. So on the y-axis we have outside air flow, not damper position, but we do have outside air temperature on the x-axis. And by the way, I have no idea what the units are on that outside air flow point, because this is a 20,000 CFM air handler, so I don't know what 8 or 10 is. But this is a whole lot easier to look at, right? I mean, you can see right away, anytime the outside air is over 80 degrees, we're obviously at minimum position. Well, that's good. But what about down there when it's below 70 degrees? Well, what you really want to see is outside air minus return air. That's when the economizer is supposed to be working. Actually do that too, right? So here's a plot, and we simply shifted the x-axis to outside air temperature minus return air temperature. And anytime outside air is less than return air, that produces a negative number, so the economizer should be open. Now it's probably okay if 5% or 10% of those points are in the cluster, where it's not open. 90% of the time the economizer would be open. But in this case, that cluster of points is 25% of the interval data. And I'm not sure that's right. I don't think that should be accepted. What about this? This really simple idea of putting outside air on the x-axis can really change the way we look at trend logs. So, I mean, if you take a look at this picture, would you say that this boiler system is running according to its design intent? This is 15-minute interval data, and so gray means there's 0 boilers running, and orange means there's 1 boiler running, and blue means there's 2 boilers running. So as outside air increases, as outside air temperature increases, we should see fewer boilers running, or boilers running less often, right? We're not seeing that. What about this? Does this look like a VAV system? As outside air temperature increases, we should see fans running faster, and vice versa. As outside air temperature decreases, we should see fans running slower, right? That doesn't really appear to be the case here. What about this one? Well, that looks more like a VAV system, right? This is the hospital, by the way. This is a 4th floor of Sand Canyon facilities off the 405. So this is actually an OSHPD system, OSHPD VAV. Everything else I'm showing you is B occupancy buildings. So let's connect the dots. And yes, connect the dots, pun intended. No matter what energy modeling software you use, they all output energy into buckets: fan energy, cooling energy, heating energy, etc. And they can all output the model into an 8,760 line spreadsheet representing the design year. So you can easily take that output and plot, let's say, fan power versus outside air temperature in the design year, and you'll get a chart that looks like this. Once you have that, you can pretty easily draw a line like this that captures 95% of the data. In other words, only 5% of the points in the design year fall above this line. Once you have that line, you can hand that line to your commissioning agent and tell your commissioning agent that during the trending period, if more than 10% of the points in the trending period fall above the line, you fail the system. Whether it's a design issue, a sequence issue, a controls issue, a data issue, if more than 10% of the points in the 72-hour training period are above the line established by the design intent, then the system is not working according to the design intent. So fail it, solve it, fix it, because it's not going to work at month 2 or month 4 or month 12. Now, it could work perfectly well on day 1 and then still fail at month 2 or month 4 or month 12, but that's a totally different story. If it doesn't work right on day 1, I guarantee it's not going to work right on month 2 or month 4 or month 12. And you can do this for fan data. You can also do this for cooling. This is a cooling data, energy data from the same model. And this is the heating energy data from the same model. We have about 5 projects right now that are putting these charts into their commissioning plan. So everybody knows before commissioning starts that this is what we're looking for energy validation. We have one project, and I think it's the one that I'm showing you, where the design engineer has actually put these charts into the commissioning specification. So then it falls under the general contractor conditions, right? In our contracts, we say that commissioning issues need to be resolved prior to final completion on the project. And so we're putting these into the specs in a section that says acceptance criteria before they ever set foot on the job site. That'll make sure that before we hand this building over to the user group, we've tested these systems and we know that the energy response to outside air temperature is appropriate and meets the design intent. So, how do I sum things? I'm trying to give you something to walk away with here, to take away. We talked about energy models versus energy predictions. One of our execs said if the designers want to do theoretical energy modeling, we can greenlight their projects and pay their fees with theoretical money. But look, I think it's going to be a market trend. You got energy dashboards and monitoring-based commissioning technology coming online. The demand is going to move, right? I mean, Title 24 right now requires segregated electrical wiring systems, and they require commissioning. So how many more code cycles is it really going to be before they require validation? We already have model codes that are coming out of the National Buildings Institute for validation of energy. We also talked about margin of error on energy models. We're saying round to 10% at least. I never thought in my life that I would give a lecture on rounding, but seriously, I earnestly believe that if you are an energy modeler, it will change your life to start rounding to 10%. Things that you have recommended, you will stop recommending. Things that you've never thought about, you will start thinking about, because you need to find things that beat the error of the model. So rounding is a huge paradigm shift. If you don't believe me on that, try it for 2 weeks. The next time you look at any set of energy data, round it to 10% and see how that changes your opinion. And we talked about this thing. It's kind of a kindergarten concept, really simple, but when it's hot outside, we should be using more cooling and more fan energy. When it's cold outside, we should be using more natural gas, less cooling, less fan energy. Right? When it's 68 degrees outside, we should be minimized on both. It's pretty simple, but it is not easy. Simple, not easy. I was talking to one of our commissioning agents the other week. She said, hey, this is a simple idea. I mean, in theory, it's just going to work, right? And I said, yeah, in theory, I can stand up off my chair right now and run an 8-minute mile. But in practice, it's not that easy. And so this isn't an easy thing to do either. But it is something that we need to start to do. I think this is going to be a market trend. We're not the only owner going through this. And if you read sort of where the future model codes are going, this is a natural evolution of the sustainability trend. So it's pretty easy to predict that, you know, what version or 2 versions from now on LEED, they're going to require validation. They're going to want to see a year's worth of data before they hand you your plaque, just to save the US GBC brand, if nothing else. I think California is going to move that way. I think ASHRAE is going to start moving that way. So I think you're going to see this real move towards putting your money where your mouth is. The key here is to come up with kind of simple behaviors that you can do during design, during construction, during startup, that'll get you to that point of energy validation, and do it more often than you don't do it. And that is all I have.